All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for finding your way away from the natural light and into this stadium with us. I asked the organizers of this event for permission to be a bit confronting with you, to challenge you with some of the more stubborn global grand challenges that we have, and not the low-hanging fruit of problems that maybe it seems easy to imagine how we would throw technology at them and arrive at a solution, but some of the deeper systemic challenges that are even getting worse. It can be normal in the context of talking about global grand challenges in tech to stand here and talk about, for instance, malnutrition or sanitation or the number of people dying from malaria or certain environmental indicators, and then to give you some sparkly examples of companies and innovators that are fixing those already. I am instead going to be going a level deeper. I'm going to show you a lot more charts than I usually would, but it's in service, I hope, to starting conversations that will last for the duration of this summit, for giving you permission to challenge the innovators, the corporate ecosystem, the public sector here, in conversation about how solutions might work. And to get started, I want to talk about what technology's promise is. I think to a certain extent you already heard some of SU's thinking about that on the main stage. You heard both Jeffrey and David giving you this vision of what technology can bring us, the abundance that's in store for us, the quasi-magical ability to resolve long-standing problems. We've been, as humanity, articulating our optimism about technology for some time now. And I've started to collect quotes that look like this. So this one, I'm going to go back more than 50 years. We've got John F. Kennedy saying, for the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and skill to relieve the suffering of more than half the world. Shoot forward 20 years, you have one of the world's sharpest scientific minds saying basically exactly the same thing. For the first time in history, it's now possible to fix all these problems. Shoot forward another 30 years, you've got somebody who's sitting on top of a $27.5 billion budget for the US government, hands deep in over 100 different global economies, fixing ministries of education, ministries of health, saying the exact same thing as those two other gentlemen. Obviously, they cannot all be correct, at least with the opening clause of what they remark. I think they were all correct to say we have the tools as humanity to keep people from dying of hunger, keep people from dying of thirst and disease, and to educate one another. Obviously, it was not the first time for the second two, possibly not even when John Kennedy said it. So we do have extraordinary power and remarkable tools. We could be living in beautiful cities. And certainly our architects, our designers, our artists, they imagined these for us. If you can just Google future city, you're going to find about 100 different breathtaking green, chrome environments, no poverty, no animals usually either, which is kind of alarming. But we can imagine this beautiful future city. That's not our problem. Our problem is that we keep building cities that look like this. Right? This is Mumbai, but it could be Dhaka, it could be Johannesburg, it could be Sao Paulo. These are the cities of today that we keep throwing up with ad hoc urban planning that can't keep pace with the rate at which we urbanize. And I want to get a sense of how knowledgeable you are in this room about the scale of the type of poverty represented on the less comfortable side of this image. And this is a question I may well be retiring this year, because audiences are getting better and better at answering it correctly. I'm just going to ask you to answer it by a show of hands. It's a simple question. How many people on the planet do you think are living on $5 a day or less? So like €4.20 or something like that. How many people are living on that amount of money or less? If you think it's 1.5 billion people, raise your hand. That's maybe 3–4% of the room raise their hand. If you think 2 billion people are living on 5 or less, raise your hand. About the same number voted for that one. How about 3 billion? 3 billion people. All right, that picked up what looks like the majority of the room. And if you think 4 billion people are living on that, okay, I'd say the last two answers were roughly tied, maybe a slight preference for 3 billion. The answer is, it's actually more than 4 billion at this point, close to 4.3 billion people. It is well over half the planet. Well over half the people on Earth right now are living on less than that amount per day. And maybe if you haven't traveled, and if you have a kind of silly notion of poor countries, you might think that you can survive okay on that, because we put our official global poverty line at $1.90, and we celebrate when we get somebody to earning $2 a day that they've graduated from extreme poverty. That is a giant that is humanity coming together to comfort ourselves with kind of arithmetical misdirection. Because if you're living on $2, $3, $4, $5 a day, you have no resilience in the face of personal, economic, climate shocks that come and hit you. Or if you get sick, if your children get sick, you can't afford anything expensive that goes down with them medically. If there's a climate shock, something bad happens to your house, you can't necessarily afford a new roof. You are super fragile, right? And you live with that fragility all the time. One of the things you can do as a people in general all the time is to challenge the rosy poverty narrative and demand that our discourse on poverty change so that we're talking about an ethical poverty line. That the ethical poverty line, and there's kind of propositions that are widespread within the EU, for instance, to say maybe that's around $7 or $8 or $9 a day. That's the point at which you can meet your basic needs for food, water, education, and shelter. You're still poor. You can't buy anything nice, and you can still become more poor. But an ethical poverty line would be more useful than the poverty line we're currently using, because the one we currently use is hiding a lot of suffering from us. And you may have heard that roughly 1 person is escaping extreme poverty every couple seconds, every 8 seconds, every 1 second, depends where you're reading, but people are escaping extreme poverty with a lot of speed. And that's part of why there's a lot of kind of backpatting globally about how good we're doing. What you may not know is that every minute, 5 people, on balance, are entering poverty on the continent of Africa. So, why is that problematic? Aside from the fact that people entering poverty is just bad on its face, we have pretty much all of the population growth of the next 80 years is accurately forecast to take place in Africa. Demographers are some of the most accurate social scientists we have. We know that by 2050, we will add 1 billion people to the continent of Africa. We'll go from roughly 1 billion people to 2 billion people. And then from 2050 to 2100, 2 more billion people. At a time when pretty much everywhere on Earth remains population in Asia is minimal. It's still not even up to 1 billion. So all these new people are coming on board in Africa. What we already know that means by 2050 is that with these statistics of how many people are born on the planet between now and 2050 will be born into extreme poverty. That's why the Gates Foundation, which released this graphic last week, and they're a notoriously optimistic organization, the Gates Foundation, very bullish on technology and solutions. This report started and said, to put it bluntly, decades of stunning progress in the fight against poverty and disease may be on the verge of stalling. This is because the poorest parts of the world are growing faster than everywhere else. They're just running 2 trends out across one another and saying, wow, we may actually start backsliding. And I'm not trying to freak you out about Africa. I have lived and worked in Africa for most of my professional life. I'll be in Somalia in 2.5 weeks working on an anti-poverty initiative. Lots of cities and nations are modernized and have great potential. But the simple math of this is that the staggering nature of global poverty has the potential to start getting worse at an alarming rate. There's a bit of an imbalance here we need to take seriously. And there's another finding that I just want to layer in here. The European Commission just released in the summer this finding by some of their own researchers that humanity currently, 84% of us live in urban areas. Now, if you've been going to conferences or watching TED Talks or even just like reading about cities in general, the statistic you have been hearing is by 2050, maybe 70% of us will live in cities. And that was already jaw-dropping. Like the first time you heard that, you were probably surprised. The first time you heard that more than 50% of humanity lives in cities, which supposedly happened, I think, 5-6 years ago, that was supposed to be a big deal. We're already at 84%. Why is this number so different? It's because of exponential technologies. It's because this number used the same definition for urban across the entire world, and it determined it based on geospatial information and machine learning, saying how dense is it, and what's the built environment, how many people per square kilometer, and what's the built environment, and is it industrial or is it housing? So they took the same standard instead of just whatever the government said, because governments have wildly different definitions of urban and wildly different research methodologies. So this is a huge thing. I don't even know what really to make of this, except to say that we may even want to introduce the concept of peak urbanization. Is it possible that we've already urbanized more than is optimal for us? Are the levels of inequality and some of the suffering that we have perhaps correlated with our failure to rapidly plan and institute the cities of the future? The other two pieces of this study that I'll just throw out there are Asia is 90% living in urban environments already. Africa, 80%. Africa's an urban continent. Who knew? Lots of people are still thinking about it as the bush. It's 80% urbanized in its residents, according to the best and most technological and consistent finding that we have now. If you're interested in digging a little bit deeper into kind of some of the magical use of statistics to cover up backsliding in progress against hunger, or to paint a rosier picture of poverty than the one that may exist, I strongly recommend this book. It came out recently. Jason Hickel's spoken with Singularity University a couple different summers during our Global Solutions program. Very popular speaker, sharp mind, active on Twitter. Give it a look. The other lens to put here is that even as, in some places, we have made remarkable progress against poverty, by like the definitions we've so far discussed, we have done it while at the same time losing massive ground on metrics of inequality. So here you have basically, since the dawn of the personal computer, a tremendous increase of inequality across all these developed countries or developed world regions, by 15 to 20% or more, right? Why does inequality matter? Sometimes people, especially with certain economic prejudices, they kind of march out and they're like, yeah, don't give me all this trouble about inequality. It's healthy, it's competition, it's good for us. There's nothing inherently wrong with inequality. It's just poverty that's problematic. Well, recent research is showing us that inequality on its own is already problematic, is already a disease of a system that correlates with lots of other symptoms that are inherently negative. Here's one that I think makes that as clear as I know how. One of the most astonishing studies that I heard about last summer was this, and the shocker of a sentence within it was that kids from poorer, less educated families tended to have thinner subregions of the prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain strongly associated with executive functioning, than better off kids. Okay, so let me unpack that for a second. They did a study in a neighborhood that had a very wide range of socioeconomic statuses. Nobody extremely poor. This was just in a kind of state in the United States, right? So nobody was starving to death. This wasn't stunting that would come from malnutrition. This was relative poverty in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And what they were finding is there, it was actually a neurological detriment to be on the poor end of a spectrum. Relative poverty, not absolute poverty, was a handicap to a very important part of our neurological development. This was just correlation. Follow-on studies are taking place. But what it would mean, for instance, is that offering a basic income could be a public health outcome. And I've been saying that for a little while, and I was happy to see that pop up as a conclusion of Johan Hari. If you don't follow Johan Hari, I would also urge you to, either whether you're on Twitter, follow him on Twitter, or his recent books. He's written about the drug war, Chasing the Scream, and he's also a prominent figure globally for raising our awareness about mental health and epidemics that are unfolding globally right now of anxiety, depression, trauma, and how these come specifically from how we organize our societies and to some extent from how we design and distribute technology. Just one other, if you're not convinced, inequality is not just causing us harm at a social level. We have shorter lifespans correlated with relative inequality, crime, violence, bad health, shorter lifespans, and the environment. The environment suffers more in environments that are, or in human systems that are unequal than it does necessarily where it's just absolutely poor. It is that spread that causes often a disdain for or an abuse of the environment. Against that background, we also have this study came out just last week. The headline language was collectively, the world is more stressed, worried, sad, and in pain today than we've ever seen it. And what I see every now and then is speakers that come out and they chide us for feeling this way. They're like, you shouldn't feel this way. The world is better than it's ever been. And we're literally like lectured at by generally wealthy white men about how we should be happier about the state of things. But the state of things, and the best research that we can do, is that on metrics of happiness and well-being, we are also declining. Lots of states are trying to figure out how do we incorporate metrics of happiness and well-being alongside GDP, alongside what other metrics we use to measure our success as a nation. Definitely try to get behind those experiments, even if you run them within your school or your company or your association. We all need to be better at this discourse. Another interesting area where I'm calling out a kind of a systemic red light is around democratic participation. So this is the most recent data from the World Bank. Again, an organization with a vested interest in painting a rosy picture because their policies have determined so much of what's going on in the world today. And they acknowledge that in the last 25 years, globally, we have seen a 10% drop-off in democratic participation. Here's Europe. You guys account for more than your fair share of that drop-off. 15% for non-formerly communist countries, over 20% for ones that were formerly communist. And what's going on with that? What does that mean? What is that telling us about the health of our systems, about how we design things, how our economies, what they reward, what our education systems focus on? Another little flashing gauge that happened just last year was, for the first year in more than a decade, we saw a global backsliding in the level of transparency about how governments and budgets are done. This was previously a really hopeful trend. It's like, great, at least we're getting clear about how we spend our money. When we have clarity, we should have better decision makings and so forth. If this continues year over year, you have another warning indicator that something about the way that power is distributed and technology is applied is now enabling more secrecy around the spending of money at a nation-state level. What we see alongside of this is also a shocking decline in the purchasing power, the relative purchasing power of the state in general. I was shocked to see this. When you're thinking about why would democratic participation be falling off, why would some of these metrics be going down, it may be relevant that the state's purchasing power is now in some cases less, is negative, they're in debt. And in other cases, it's next to nothing compared to industry or the private individual. You can look for correlations in this data as much as you like, but it is telling you something. It is indicative of something when you start to wonder about the health of the state, its relative merit. And when this is the case, who's meant to look after the environment? With what system do we protect this planet if this is the relative power of our collective bargaining mechanisms? I'm curious, how many of you are familiar, I want to see a show of hands here as well, how many of you are familiar with the planetary boundaries? Raise your hand if this is a framework that's familiar to you. Okay, great. I'm happy then to be able to introduce it to you. It comes from the Stockholm Resilience Center. The scientists most famous for advocating it are Johan Rockström and Owen Gaffney. Stockholm Resilience Center is a partner of Singularity University. They've come and they've co-run many sessions with lots of our different audiences, especially our startups, trying to help us figure out how to have an intelligent discourse about protecting the planet. This is a dashboard of planetary health, and it's conceived of as having an area of safe operating procedures, safe operating parameters. What that means, if you're a scientist, is the area is safe that you're operating within if we can forecast the results of operating there. If you go outside of the safe area, you're taking actions that are so drastic that we don't know what will happen to Earth ecosystems. Right? So that's what they've done. It's kind of probabilistic, and it says, from the best of our modeling, the best of what we can do, we know that exceeding this level of nitrogen loading, this level of chemical pollution, this level of ozone depletion, means we can't even tell you what happens. All the best minds of us cannot. And if you look at this, we have blown past that boundary in 2 of 9 planetary boundaries. Biodiversity loss, totally out of control, totally unacceptable, ridiculously stupid. We can create all the technology in the world that we want. If we encounter some species from somewhere else and we want to trade with them, you don't think they're going to be artificially intelligent too? The biological intelligence that was super unique to us, that only we have, we're treating that like garbage and just cooking it up. Rainforest, reef after rainforest, reef. Now, there's a cool build on this, which incorporates underneath the ceiling of environmental thresholds that we ought to consider, a social floor, kind of maps into the planetary boundaries, social boundaries, for the health that we have around education, gender equality, violence. This is a very recent set of economic work from Kate Raworth. What I would recommend is that if you have any leadership clout, if you have leverage within your organization, within a school that you're on the school board of, within a municipal government, these are frameworks that you can introduce. And the reason that you should is globally, everyone is. And the more that people adopt them, the more that the citizens are asking about these frameworks, the more the policies will look after you, the people you love. They're great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, and the planet that's supposed to still be sustaining us then. So these are tools. Please use them. They're really great, and they're scientifically based, and they're open and free for you. One last thing before I start turning this into slightly cheerier territory. This cuts against the kind of most peaceful time in the world narrative, which in many ways that has a lot of truth to it. But something that we can no longer hide from is that there are twice as many civil conflicts today as there were in 2001. Twice as many. And according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, roughly half of these wars involve between 3 and 9 different warring parties. A fifth of them have more than 10. So with the increased complexity of conflict comes increased staying power of conflict. These are complex emergencies, metastasizing in different world areas, usually around a whole complex set of factors. But we can't just turn away from this. These are new facts. And a lot of these, they have to specify, these are opposing groups. The state may not even be involved. We already looked at the state going bankrupt relative to the other parties. You've got a narco state all over the place. So this is another indicator of system ill health. So that's all pretty grim so far. We've got poverty, inequality, overloaded urban areas, unhappiness, planetary disarray, rising complex wars, unhealthy democracy, and a decline in transparency. So where's technology in all of this? All right, I told you we were going to be talking about technology's promise. It's supposed to be fixing everything. So why are some very important metrics getting worse, even as technology showers us with breakthrough after breakthrough on an almost weekly basis? If you ask yourself, in your mind, why is humanity failing to deliver on the promise of technology? And ask yourself it. I've found that for a lot of people in the room, that is a fantastic question for revealing biases that you have. Biases that you either have about humans themselves, maybe you think we're flawed, it's human nature, we're greedy, we're bad people when you get to the very bottom of it. Maybe it's a belief you have about other people, certain regions. Maybe it's government's bad, government's to blame. Maybe it's private industry, extractivists. If you had something that you blamed in that was like mappable to a place or a nation or anything even more unlikely like an ethnicity, you're being shown your biases. And they're coming up to protect you from the ugly fact that it is our responsibility to keep technology's promise. All of us, constantly. The faster technology changes, the better we have to become at keeping that promise. And so, I want to talk for a second about two of the different things that actually, specifically with technology, influence our ability to make things worse. Because if we're not honest about them, then it keeps us from doing a good job as stewards of technology's future. The gentleman on this slide is named Kentaro Toyama. The book he's holding up, he published a few years ago, Geek Heresy. He's a coder, he's worked in Silicon Valley for a while, he was paid lots of money by Microsoft to research educational technologies. He actually runs a super successful nonprofit that does education all around the world, more successfully than anyone else, to small-scale farmers. They got started in India, they're scaling up. So he's a really smart, technologically minded practitioner of technology use. And he went and he researched education technology over all this period and found that there was something that he named the law of amplification. The law of amplification is that technology's primary effect is to amplify human forces. So what did that mean? One of the findings in that book that kind of surprised me came from a California-embedded, super teched-up guy at UCLA who said the introduction of information and communication technologies in schools serves to amplify existing forms of inequality. And I think that's counterintuitive to some extent. Because we're used to thinking, oh, if you just kind of spread technology on a crappy school system, everything will get better. And what this found was that no, what happens is that the wealthy and advantaged places get much better because the advantages they had are amplified, but the ones that were in disarray or were broken actually got worse. It made it worse what you brought with it. There was a fun article in Time magazine not too long ago that runs through some of the great supporting evidence of that in a nice digestible format, so if you want to have a look, go check there. Two of the examples that they gave are, they said, look, if there's a company, a private company that's not making money, it's failing as a company, Nobody thinks that like giving it state-of-the-art data centers and new computers and better software is going to make that business suddenly succeed as a business. But we look at schools and we think that. It's not. It's just going to distract people who already suck at business. And they're going to suck at business worse with new distractions. If you have a great vocabulary and supportive parents, you can go onto Wikipedia and you can make wonderful use of it. If you have attention deficit disorder and you're not well supervised and you go onto the internet, you'll just be distracted by games. That was technology, amplifying the inequality that pre-existed, inherent to the type of learning you were doing. But that's like old school technology. What about the new stuff we're doing with like machine learning and artificial intelligence? Can't it just teach you individually how you want to learn? Yeah, that potential exists, right? And I'm optimistic for it. But it will only come to be if we're mindful about how we design, at every step, our algorithms, and how we interpret the data that we gather at every step. Virginia Eubanks is someone who I think has her finger on the pulse of the greatest threats to our incorporation of artificial intelligence today. She's not worried about killer robots in the future. She's worried right now about discrimination and encoding bias and encoding inequality within our algorithmic systems. And there's great research in this book. I highly recommend it. Here's some examples of what it looks like. I think this is pretty funny. The American Civil Liberties Union got Amazon's cloud-based facial recognition service, and they took the faces of the US Congress, and they ran the US Congress against a big database of criminals, and Amazon's public service said that 28 members of Congress are criminal. I think there's way more of them that are criminal than that. I think it's way higher. But none of these were accurate matches, none of them at all. And, problematically, about 40% of the false matches were people of color. And I wish that 40% of our Congress was people of color. Our country would be it'd be a better place if that was the case. But that's not a representative sampling. So this cloud service disproportionately discriminated against and raised flags about are people of color, including like civil rights heroes that are in their 70s or 80s were being pinged as criminals here. And the ACLU only had to spend $12.33 to run this super convenient cloud-based facial recognition process across Congress. So any number of the stakes are low in this case, but imagine if a police officer is pulling someone over, runs a system like this, false recognizes that, oh, this person matches someone with a concealed weapon, that one time had a weapon. Are they going to get, is that citizen going to get the same fair treatment by that officer of the law? Right? There are very real problems when you bake racism into an algorithm and then start deploying it through who gets health care, who gets promoted. We've seen private companies start to do this in the context of their HR, and reviews on the receiving end are that it's brutal. You know, if there's an HR director who's hiring people and they're biased, they might not get away for it for too long. But if you automate the bias, and the bias just doesn't like the accent of the employee, you can probably hide that bias for quite some time. So, pivoting now into where I think our hopes lie, it's being principle-driven in our design. We can't just leave it up to chance, because when we leave it up to chance, we bake our biases into what we do. We replicate systems that are creating inequalities and dropping levels of participation and causing the problems that I spent the first 20 minutes talking to you about. The principles for digital development have been adopted by most of the UN, the entire World Bank Group, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, many government giving branches like DFID or USAID, and now all of those organizations, whenever they fund technology to help with poverty, education, water, anything, they have to comply with these standards. Some of them are kind of soft, but some of them are a big deal. It has to be an open source. It has to be in an open repository. You have to reuse and improve things. You have to recycle where that's possible, instead of just constantly spending money on the same things, enclosing them and trying to get licensing fees. That was a waste of public money. What does it look like in practice? UNICEF launched an innovation fund. They had to cap donations really quickly because they got $10 million like within a week, and they weren't even prepared to spend that much money. And that was even though they were not offering financial return to the investors. Their return was they were going to quantify the value of what was created and tell them you had this much impact, but you don't get your money back. The condition for receiving money from this fund is that whatever you build, your company builds, it has to go onto GitHub. It has to be in the open source community. And that's so that people can take that idea and quickly implement it somewhere else. We don't have time to wait for you to slowly build up your empire and go into your next market. When David was telling us about the churn on the S&P 500, which I'll mention in a minute, the idea is that the relevance of any given solution is shortening. The window in time when it works is going to be shorter. So if it's good and if it helps and it was funded by public money, it should be open. We should encourage people everywhere to apply it as soon as we can. Some of the things that they funded include a blockchain startup that enables teachers and educators to better monitor the attendance and grading systems that they have. This system in South Africa has already saved about 55,000 hours of teacher time in its first year just across 77 schools. If you like it, pick it up, copy it, run it in Portugal. Chemmetrica are doing really cool stuff with machine learning, algorithms that can tell if a child is malnourished just by looking at their face instead of anything more invasive. And they have a different way of protecting the data about the child so that this potentially embarrassing or harmful information doesn't get out in the future. It's not just the digital development principles, but the Creative Commons Foundation have become a very powerful lobbying wing going around and changing how public money flows. Those are the two Twitter handles. You can follow their victories. Here's an example of one that changes an entire ecosystem. The US Department of Education just last year agreed that they would spend their $4.5 billion annual budget only on creating open educational resources. That means no more contracts for like a private company like Pearson to just slightly update by 5% an already crappy textbook that they charge $100 per student for. Now, the resources are being developed like on Wikipedia. That would be your point of reference, right? There are now physics textbooks that are open and alive and constantly improved. So all of the students coming through all of the government schools, that's their normal now. So when you start interacting with them in the workforce in 7 or 8 years, if you're not operating in that way, they're going to be more efficient. Their whole decision-making approach will be better than what you do. Bulgaria passed a similar law to demand that all software written for the government had to be developed in public in a public repository. Imagine what that does to corruption in procurement. It's a really bold, really brave idea to do that, and it increases your citizenry's literacy about digital matters. And I liked this example because Microsoft got together with National Geographic, which is a Rupert Murdoch offshoot now, and those guys are launching a project to get people to throw artificial intelligence at biodiversity challenges, and their condition is that whatever you figure out to solve biodiversity challenges needs to be open source. So there's a real change happening around the expectations, even from super private sector actors, about where change needs to go, how it needs to be shared. So this is a graph that often gets shown. Wait But Why is a great tech blog. You can check it out to read about artificial intelligence and longevity. I show it in the context of the same thing that David was talking about, this churn that we have. A company falls off the S&P 500 every 2 weeks. So when you have shortening lifespans of relevance, one of the things that happens is you get better at governance because you have more cycles, you iterate faster, you have more at-bats. This is the guy that founded Coinbase, and he said that we're going to learn more about governance in the next 10 years than we did in the last 100. And that's true of the we that he speaks from, white cryptographic computer engineers. It should be true of the we that all of you represent, and it can be. And I'd encourage you to come to the session that I'm running tomorrow about disruptions from the social sector, because I'll talk to you about some of the things that allow you to participate in this governance renaissance. So I want to kind of close also by coming back to Jason Hickel, this scholar of poverty, who said that the morally relevant metric of progress is the extent of global poverty vis-a-vis our capacity to end it. And by that measure, we are doing worse than at any time in history. We are actively breaking technology's promise, and we're doing it because we've got this little straitjacket in our mind based on the templates of business that we were handed, the templates of democracy that we were handed, that we have not been questioning enough, let alone questioning our own biases. That's why we keep making these junky cities that aren't getting us anywhere we want to be. So I hope that over the next 2 days, you will ask tough questions about the design, about the assumptions, about the bias that get baked into even the sparkliest technologies, and try to bring those questions back into the living and working that you do here in the Portuguese ecosystem. Thank you very much.